I live with the hardest working shepherd in the world. Try not to smile at his goofy antics. Snow drifted silently across the lonely pine ridge, soft as breath and cold as memory. Inside a small wooden cabin, a man named Ethan Vance moved with the rigid precision of someone who had long forgotten how to live any other way. Ethan was a 47-year-old former Navy SEAL canine handler, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face carved by wind, war, and winters he pretended didn't hurt. His jaw was angular beneath several days of stubble, the kind that clung like a habit rather than a choice. His dark blonde hair, streaked with early gray, was kept short in the military style he never abandoned. His blue eyes, once sharp as Arctic steel, now carried the dullness of a storm long spent, the kind that leaves behind only cold air and silence. They were the eyes of a man who had loved deeply and lost violently, and who now filled his days by polishing order into every corner of his world. Ethan lived alone in the cabin tucked between two towering spruces, a place he had retreated to after the death of Bear, his canine partner and closest companion. Bear had been a massive, sable-coated German shepherd, a war-scarred hero with a calm, disciplined spirit, and the unwavering loyalty of a soldier who never broke rank. The dog had saved Ethan's life more times than Ethan could count, and in the end gave his own in a blast meant for the team. Since then, Ethan's world had shrunk into a few repetitive motions. Waking at 5 sharp, making the bed with hospital corner precision, eating measured meals, running the same 3-mile trail until the muscles in his legs stopped burning. The cabin itself mirrored his internal barricades. Everything had a place. Everything stayed where it belonged. The kitchen counter gleamed with a cold emptiness. The floors, swept daily, reflected the lamplight like polished ice. Even the rustic wooden walls, once charming, now appeared like the ribs of a structure designed to cage a man rather than shelter him. But the inside of Ethan's mind was far less orderly. Each quiet morning carried the weight of memories he avoided like tripwires. Each shadow reminded him of the ghost at his heels, Bear's last bark, Bear's final leap, Bear's stillness. In the basement, hidden beneath a tarp and decades of dust, sat a wooden box. Inside were Bear's collar, his service ribbons, a worn tennis ball, a folded American flag, and the shredded remains of the vest he had died wearing. Ethan hadn't opened it since the funeral. The thought of doing so felt like reopening a wound that had never fully closed. Every night he walked past the basement door without touching the handle. Some wounds, he believed, were meant to remain sealed. One late afternoon, as clouds thickened over the mountains, Ethan was finishing his routine weapons maintenance. It was a pointless ritual. He no longer needed the weapon, but the rhythmic motion kept his thoughts from unraveling. He was wiping the barrel with slow, practiced movements when the phone rang. The sound startled him. Few people had his number, and even fewer dared use it. He hesitated before answering. "Vance," he said, voice low, steady. On the other end was a woman with a calm, slightly raspy voice, the kind belonging to someone accustomed to long hours and difficult responsibilities. Her name was Alexei Rowan, a 38-year-old rescue coordinator at the Timberline Wildlife and Shelter Unit. She was tall and lean, with auburn hair usually tied in a low knot, freckled skin that flushed easily in the cold, and a composed manner that hinted at a life spent rescuing more creatures than people. She spoke with gentle authority, and though Ethan had only met her twice before, he remembered the quiet determination in her amber-brown eyes that reflected resilience forged through years of exhaustion and compassion. Today, her voice carried urgency wrapped in hesitation. "Mr. Vance, we found a German Shepherd puppy. Alone. Malnourished, shivering. No mother nearby. No chips. We're overwhelmed this week and—" She paused. The silence weighted with unspoken hope. "We were wondering if you could foster him, Just until we stabilize things here. Ethan froze. A shepherd. His spine stiffened instinctively. Memories surged. Bear's bark, bear's warmth, bear's sacrifice. A knot tightened in his chest, sharp as a blade. A puppy? He muttered, his tone guarded. Yes, Alexei replied. He's small, maybe 3 months. Brown coat, extremely skittish. He trembles whenever anyone touches him. But his eyes... She hesitated again. His eyes look like he's waiting for someone who never came back. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew that look, knew it too well. Part of him wanted to refuse. Another routine would be disrupted. Another life could be lost. And another wound might split open. But another part, smaller, quieter, buried deep, felt the stir of something he couldn't name. Maybe duty. Maybe guilt. Maybe the faint whisper of bear in the back of his mind. Bring him here, Ethan said before he could stop himself. The words slipped out like a confession. Alexei exhaled in relief. We'll arrive within the hour. Ethan set down the gun, his hands unsteady. He paced the room, each step echoing like approaching footsteps of a past he had never outrun. When the truck finally pulled up, the door opened and Alexei stepped out carrying a crate. Inside was the shepherd pup, thin, trembling, with matted brown fur and eyes so wide and fearful that Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. Those eyes were the same deep, wounded brown he had seen on Bear the day they pulled him from the rubble of an insurgent hideout. This tiny creature looked just as lost. Ethan slowly knelt, his breath faltering. The puppy backed into the corner of the crate, shaking violently, every bone visible beneath its small frame. Ethan did not reach in. He simply murmured, "It's all right, kid." The same words he once whispered to Bear. For the first time in years, something warm broke through the cold armor around his heart. Ethan Vance did not yet know it, but the moment he met those frightened brown eyes, the course of his life, quietly, irrevocably, changed. Morning light filtered weakly through the frosted cabin windows, laying pale gold across the wooden floorboards as Ethan Vance moved through the kitchen with the same deliberate quiet he had practiced for years. The air inside the cabin felt different now, not warmer exactly, but less hollow, as if the shadows had softened around the edges. Somewhere beneath the bed in the spare room, the small shepherd pup he had agreed to foster pressed himself into the farthest corner, trembling each time Ethan's boots crossed the hallway. The dog was still little more than skin and bone, perhaps 3 months old at most, with a soft brown coat that darkened in streaks along his back. His ears were too big for his tiny head, one standing upright while the other folded slightly like a wilted leaf. His ribs showed faintly under the thin fur, and his paws looked oversized, as if he was a creature destined to grow into something much larger than his fragile body suggested. His eyes, deep brown and filled with the kind of fear that came from abandonment rather than instinct, watched every movement with silent wariness. Ethan crouched outside the doorway, setting down a shallow metal bowl with slow, steady hands. "You can eat when you're ready, kid," he murmured, his voice a low rasp softened by patience. Only when he stood and walked away did the pup creep out, step by small step, his tail tucked firmly beneath him. It went on like this for 2 days. The puppy, though terrified, seemed drawn to the sound of Ethan's voice. Not the words, but the cadence, the steadiness, the subtle gentleness beneath the rough exterior. On the evening of the 3rd day, the wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows of the cabin like distant artillery. Ethan sat on the worn leather armchair, staring into the fire as it cracked and hissed. He could hear faint, hesitant footsteps coming down the hallway. The rhythm was wrong for a human, too light, too uncertain. Then he saw a small, trembling shape appear at the edge of the firelight. The pup stood there, looking between Ethan and the open space near the hearth, unsure if he was permitted to enter. "You don't have to keep your distance," Ethan said quietly, turning his head only enough so the dog knew he wasn't being ignored. The pup inched forward, sniffing the air. Eventually, with a cautiousness that made Ethan's chest ache, he approached the folded wool blanket laid beside the chair, Bear's blanket, still carrying the faint, comforting scent of a dog long gone. The pup circled it twice, then curled into the center of it and lay down. Ethan's breath caught. He had expected the blanket to remain untouched, a relic preserved out of respect. But now, seeing the small shepherd lying there, shaking less than before, finally resting, felt like the first thaw after a long, bitter winter. "Eco," Ethan said suddenly, the name coming out without planning. The pup lifted his head. Ethan offered a faint smile. "That'll be your name. A little echo of someone who meant a lot." Echo blinked slowly, then rested his head again on the blanket. That night, Ethan finally opened the dusty wooden box in the basement. Inside lay Bear's collar, still scarred from years of service. Bear's old tennis ball, indented from hard training sessions, and the folded American flag awarded after his final mission. Ethan touched each item with rough fingertips, feeling emotions he had buried too deeply. Eco appeared at the basement doorway, drawn by curiosity or perhaps by the silent grief pressing through the floorboards. He sat there quietly, ears angled forward, watching Ethan with those dark, thoughtful eyes that seemed far too knowing for a puppy. "He saved my life more than once," Ethan whispered, "and I couldn't save his." His voice broke at the last word, the sound unfamiliar after years of holding everything inside. Eco didn't approach, didn't whine, didn't try to bridge the space between them with physical comfort. He simply watched, still and steady, as if bearing witness. And somehow, that was enough. The days that followed carried the gentle shift of something healing. Eco stopped hiding under beds and began trailing Ethan in the kitchen, watching as he chopped wood or prepared meals with the precision of a soldier who had nothing left but routine. Outside on the porch, Eco would sit beside the doorway, never stepping into the snow unless Ethan did first, always checking the world through Ethan's reactions. In the garden behind the cabin, now frozen under a layer of winter crust, Eco walked cautiously, sniffing every corner as though mapping a territory that didn't yet feel like his own. But the blanket remained his sanctuary. If the world felt too loud or too sudden, he would retreat to it, circle twice, then curl up, always glancing toward Ethan before closing his eyes. And each time, Ethan felt a quiet pull inside him, a reminder that companionship did not always arrive in bold declarations. Sometimes it walked in on soft paws, trembling but determined, asking only for space to exist without fear. One evening, as the sun bled over the mountains in streaks of blue and ember orange, Ethan stood at the threshold of the cabin, watching Eco sniff tentatively at the falling snow. The pup lifted his head, and for the first time his tail moved. Just a twitch, hesitant but hopeful. Ethan's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. Something inside him loosened, like a knot pulled free after years of tension. Eco had begun stepping out of the shadows. And with every small step he took, Ethan felt he was doing the same. Thin sunlight crept through the haze of a late winter morning, touching the edges of the cabin with hesitant warmth. The snow outside had settled into soft drifts, muffling the world beyond the porch, leaving the surroundings wrapped in a quiet stillness that made every tiny sound inside the house feel louder, sharper, more intimate. Ethan Vance moved through the cabin carrying a canvas bag of firewood, his broad frame casting long shadows across the floor. His shoulders, usually held with rigid discipline, had begun to relax these days, just slightly, just enough to betray the gentle shift happening inside him. Eco padded behind him with slow, curious steps. The pup had grown fuller in the last week, gaining a bit of healthy weight. His ribs no longer showed so sharply beneath his brown fur. His legs, though still slightly awkward and oversized, carried him with more confidence. The fur around his muzzle was beginning to fluff out, and his ears, one perfectly upright, one still stubbornly folded, gave him a boyish, earnest look. His eyes remained soft and observant, the deep brown of wet earth after rain, revealing a keen attentiveness that made him seem older and wiser than his small frame allowed. In the mornings, Eco had begun establishing his own rituals. The moment Ethan came back from his run, Eco would trot over to investigate his boots, nudging at the laces and sniffing the dried mud with meticulous interest, as if conducting a security check on every object that crossed the threshold. Ethan watched him with a mixture of amusement and aching fondness. "You'd make Bear proud," he murmured once, and Eco wagged his tail, tentatively at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. The transformation was subtle, but steady. Eco no longer fled at sudden noises. He no longer froze when Ethan approached too quickly. Instead, he began to follow Ethan as he moved through the house, watching him chop vegetables, stack firewood, or kneel to tie his laces. What surprised Ethan most was how Eco never demanded anything. The pup simply existed near him, a calm presence that filled the empty spaces without intruding. One afternoon, as Ethan stepped outside to refill the bird feeder, Eco discovered the leaking pipe beneath the porch steps. The dripping water fascinated him. The pup leapt forward, trying to catch each drop mid-air, snapping gently as the cold water splashed across his face. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, shaking his head. "You're going to freeze your nose off doing that," he grumbled, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The pup continued unabated, his clumsy enthusiasm brightening a corner of Ethan's heart he thought had gone dark forever. When spring threatened in brief warm spells, Ethan began preparing the soil in the small garden behind the house, a habit from the years before Bear died. As he knelt to dig the first row, he felt a soft thump beside him. Eco was digging too, his little paws sending dirt flying backward with surprising force. Unfortunately, Eco's chosen spot was exactly where Ethan had just planted a precious sprout of early lettuce. "Hey, kid, no, not there," Ethan barked reflexively. Eco stopped digging, glancing up with a bewildered tilt of his head. His ears perked, tongue peeking from the side of his mouth. He looked absurdly proud of himself. Ethan sighed, defeated. "Yeah. I know. You thought you were helping." He gently moved the pup aside and replanted the seedling, shaking his head but unable to hide the grin tugging at his lips. As days passed, the cabin grew warmer, not from the return of spring, but from the way Eco settled into every corner of Ethan's routine. At night, when Ethan sat in his leather chair reading, Eco would pad over and curl beneath it, resting his chin on Ethan's boot. His breathing softened into a slow rhythm, and Ethan found himself lingering longer over each page just to feel the weight of that tiny, trusting presence. But one evening, when Ethan reached for a box on a high shelf in the kitchen, something in his back shifted sharply. A familiar sting shot down his left leg, the old injury from his final mission flaring without warning. He gripped the counter, jaw clenched, breath caught between his teeth. Eco watched from across the room, ears flattening. The pup approached slowly, steps careful, head lowered, not in fear but in concern. He lay down beside Ethan's foot, pressing his warmth gently into Ethan's ankle. The protection, the awareness, the instinct. It was all so painfully reminiscent of Bear that Ethan had to close his eyes. The next day brought a colder kind of fear. Eco, now growing bolder and more curious, managed to slip behind an old cupboard Ethan had never bothered to secure properly. Ethan heard the frantic scrabbling and rushed in, panic flaring through him as violently as a battlefield flashback. "Eco!" he called, heart pounding. Silence answered him. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp protest of his injured back, reaching helplessly into the small gap. "Kid, come on! Come out, please!" The word "please" fell from his mouth without thought, raw and trembling. Finally, a small brown shape emerged from the shadows, blinking up at him with confusion rather than fear. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath and slumped onto the floor, his palms pressed to the cold wood. Eco approached and nudged Ethan's knee gently before curling against his hip, as if apologizing without understanding why it mattered. Later that afternoon, when Ethan patched a crack in the cement walkway outside, Eco trotted across the still wet patch with innocent obliviousness. Tiny paw prints followed in a neat line, organic, imperfect, alive. Ethan stared at them for a long time. Then, instead of smoothing them over, he took a small stick and etched the words beside the tracks. "Canine Cadet, welcome home." The fading daylight caught the wet cement, illuminating the imprint not just of paws, but of a bond forming, soft, cautious, and profoundly real. In that quiet moment, Ethan realized Eco had crossed a threshold Bear once guarded, a threshold leading into the deepest part of his guarded heart. And this time, Ethan did not shut the door. Dawn crept over the Alaskan tree line in muted gold, brushing the snow-laced branches with soft light. Inside the cabin, the air was still, warmed by the faint crackle of embers in the stove. Ethan Vance stood in the narrow hallway, his hand resting on the edge of the mirror that hung beside the bedroom door. He had passed this mirror thousands of times without looking, without daring to. But this morning, a subtle shift in the house drew his attention. His reflection stared back. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a stubbled jaw and weary blue eyes that had carried too much war for too many years. The gray in his hair had deepened, threading through the dark blonde like winter frost. But today his expression was softer. The rigid lines around his mouth eased. And there, in the bottom corner of the mirror's frame, lay Eco. The young shepherd was curled tightly on Bear's old blanket, his small body warming the floorboards with quiet breaths. His ears twitched with each exhale, and his paw pressed gently against the edge of the mirror's reflection, as though he were anchoring Ethan's image in place. Ethan felt something ease inside him, something he thought had fossilized long ago. Not joy, exactly, but the first true hint of belonging since the day Bear had died. Eco stirred, lifting his head and blinking sleepily. The pup's brown eyes softened when they found Ethan's reflection in the glass, and his tail thumped, once, twice, hesitantly against the blanket. The fragile trust contained in that small gesture settled deep into Ethan's chest. Later that evening, the two walked onto the front porch as the sun dipped behind the distant peaks. The sky was a canvas of gentle colors, lavender fading to rose, rose to amber, amber to the quiet blue of oncoming dusk. Ethan eased himself onto the weathered wooden chair, the slats creaking under his weight. Eco sat at his feet, his fluffy tail curling neatly around his body. The wind carried the scent of spruce and frozen soil, the kind of air that cleared the mind but chilled the bones. Yet neither of them moved. They simply watched the sun descend, the silence between them full rather than empty. For once, Ethan felt no loneliness, only presence, only peace. It had been years since he had felt this kind of stillness, years since he had sat beside another living being without the subtle tension of waiting for loss. For a moment he closed his eyes and let the world settle around him. That night, after the cabin grew quiet and the sky turned pitch black beyond the windows, Ethan did something he had avoided since leaving the Navy. He set his phone on a stack of old manuals on the bookshelf and switched the camera to record mode. The small red light blinked in the dim room, casting a faint glow over the leather armchair where he sat. His shoulders were straighter than usual, and though his face carried the hardness forged from decades of discipline, his eyes held vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. He spoke slowly, not the clipped, efficient tone of a soldier, but the unsteady cadence of a man learning to find his voice again. He talked about Bear, the sacrifice, the silence that followed, the years of walking in emotional shadow. He admitted he had stopped believing in second chances. He confessed that solitude had felt safer than letting anyone close again. And then he spoke of Eco, the trembling pup who had arrived like an echo of everything he had lost, the small creature who followed him through the cabin, guarded him with pure instinct, and unknowingly pushed the walls inside Ethan's heart further apart each day. "He didn't fix me," Ethan said into the camera, his voice low. "He just gave me a reason to look up again." The recording captured the raw honesty of a man who had lived through war, grief, and isolation, and had somehow found gentleness on the other side. Toward the end, soft padding echoed from the hallway. Eco appeared, walking into the frame with a sleepy wobble and a slight tilt of his head. Without hesitation, he hopped onto the wooden side table, circled twice, and curled up beside Ethan's leg. His small body pressed warmly against Ethan's thigh. The pup let out a soft sigh and rested his muzzle on Ethan's knee. Ethan looked into the camera, his gaze steady but tender. "Family isn't always blood," he murmured. "Sometimes it finds you on four paws." Eco lifted his head, nudged Ethan's arm, and then settled again, this time even closer. The intimacy of the gesture, the quiet trust, struck Ethan harder than any battlefield memory. When he reached out, he didn't touch Eco. Instead, he let his hand rest near the pup's paw, close enough to offer safety, but not close enough to demand it. Eco responded by inching forward, laying his paw across the back of Ethan's fingers in silent acceptance. Ethan ended the recording there, pressing the screen with a breath he hadn't realized he held. The cabin dimmed into darkness, save for the soft orange glow of the dying fire. Eco climbed into Ethan's lap, curled himself into a tight ball of warm fur, and released the first soft whine Ethan had ever heard from him. Not fear, not pain, something gentler, something like contentment. Ethan rested a hand carefully on Eco's back, feeling the rhythmic rise and fall of the pup's breathing. In that moment, he understood in quiet clarity that home wasn't the cabin, nor the routine, nor the memories of service long past. Home was the small, beating life choosing to stay beside him. Home was Eco's breath against his chest. Home was this second chance he never asked for, but desperately needed. And for the first time since Bear died, Ethan whispered into the silence. Not a command, not a plea, but a promise. "You're safe here, kid." In the quiet corners of life, where grief lingers and hope feels distant, sometimes God sends us the smallest signs to guide us back toward the light. Not always thunder, not always miracles that shake the earth. Sometimes it's a trembling pup, a gentle breath against a lonely heart, or a moment that reminds us we were never meant to walk this world alone. If Ethan and Eco's journey touched you, take a moment to reflect on the unexpected ways God may already be working in your life, through kindness, through companionship, through little mercies you may have overlooked. If this story spoke to your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, share this message with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of healing, faith, and second chances. May God watch over you, bless your home, and place a gentle light on every path you take.